I realize that I failed to introduce myself when I introduced the panel, but I'm Nicholas Mizer from Texas A&M University. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics and the history of geekdom and some of the boundary-making things that I've seen coming up in that area. So in March of 2010, Coil House Magazine Online published an article by Joshua Ellis entitled "Children by the Millions Wait for Alex Chilton." And in that article, Ellis reflects on his 20 years of experience with what he variously calls alternative culture or geek culture, starting with his 1991 exposure in a friend's basement to the Pixies song "Wave of Mutilation." And in describing that first experience, Ellis says that he uses almost mystical terms, saying that he, in that moment, was exposed. He says that it was comparable to a dark night of the soul, in which he was exposed to the various cultural architectures that one might choose to live in. And he ends that reflection with another bookend of himself in a local Las Vegas bar near his house, listening to a young hardcore punk band perform. And as watching them, he realizes that, from his perspective, although very enthusiastic about what they were doing, these young punks were no longer signifying the same sorts of rebellion that he tied up with his alternative identity, something that he largely attributed to the growth of the internet, which made everything normal and acceptable, so that there was no rebellion possible. It's kind of this all-consuming cultural force. And so Ellis reflected on this disorientation that he felt and ended up walking away from the bar, sort of a wistful sense, saying that the revolution was long over, not because we'd lost, but because we'd won. We'd remade the world in our image, and the world didn't care about us anymore. 9 months later, Patton Oswalt released an article on Wired magazine, very similar, called "Wake Up Geek Culture, Time to Die," with the Blade Runner reference, very intentional on his part. And Oswalt's article is very similar. He's reflecting on his experiences in geek culture, which he uses almost exclusively in that piece, and talks about growing up, getting into Star Wars and learning all the stats for D&D monsters and so forth. And he uses very similar spatial language. Ellis talked about cultural architectures. Oswalt talked about otaku-esque thought palaces that he and his friends were constructing together, drawing on the Japanese word usually translated as geek, but also has associations with house and domesticity and enclosure. And so he has this very similar sense of disorientation. He actually says that it seemed like everything that was part of my otaku world was out in the open and up for grabs, if only out of context. I wasn't seeing the hard line between nerds and normals anymore. So he has this profound disorientation, and it kind of makes him a little bit more angry, whereas Ellis was sort of wistful. Oswalt is getting worked up, and of course he's a comic, so he plays that aspect up. But he describes, for example, being at a gym and seeing what he describes as a gym douche bro with a Boba Fett tattoo, and he realizes that that signifier no longer meant for him what it did when he was younger. And he also attributes this change to the internet. It says that the internet allows people to become instantly otaku, which he describes as a weak form of otaku, or a weak form of geekdom. And he says there are no more hidden thought palaces. They're easily accessed websites or Facebook pages with thousands of fans. And this is concerning to him, because now with everyone more or less otaku, he says everything is immediately awesome. The old inner longing for more or better that made our present pop culture so amazing is dwindling. And he describes a sort of foretells in comedic, prophetic tone the coming of the Edowoff singularity. Edowoff stands for everything that ever was available forever. The moment at which all of the pop culture mashups become self-aware. And to give you a sense of what he means by that, I'll read you his quotation. A brilliant Nathan Rabin column about the worst Turkish ripoffs of American comic book characters will suddenly begin writing its own comments, each a single sentence from the sequel to Confederacy of Dunces. Then a fourth and fifth season of Arrested Development, directed by David Milch of Deadwood, will suddenly appear in the TV shows section of iTunes. Someone bitch wearing a Crass bootleg will suddenly find their hard drive crammed with Elvis Presley's Lost Grunge album from 1994, and everyone's TiVo will record Ghostbusters 3 starring Peter Sellers, Lee Marvin, and John Candy. So he has this idea, jokingly talking about, with everything becoming so accessible, the only thing in his view is to have this geek singularity, which he then describes as being followed by a state of apocalypse, where it has rained cleansing fire down on the landscape. So just wipe it all out and we'll start over and build a new geek culture because this one is not where he wants to live anymore. So I open with those reflections because I found them after 2 years after they were written. And together with their attendant comment threads, I'm left with these two sort of state of the geek addresses and how the self-identified geeks in the comments responded to those posts. But before I get into that sort of sense making that I've gone through and trying to figure out why this sense of disorientation was there, why the commenters often disagreed with and emphasized generational differences between themselves and Patton and Ellis, I want to just talk about what I mean by geek drawing from what the commenters said. So the first thing is an obsessive love of cultural interests, which we referenced in the first paper. And commenter Ramona Girl says, geek culture is that which focuses on things no one else notices and learns to love them as the things that make all the difference. And a geek vlogger named John Green has made that sort of understanding of geek culture. He's been part of making that very widely known. On the other hand is what one commenter called participating in the make. So this idea that ordinary geeks are not just consuming content and becoming experts, they are creating it. So this relationship between consumer and producer and the kind of prosumer idea being central to geek identity. So combining those two, my working definition here is thinking of geeks as individuals who bond with one another over a shared exuberance for creative consumption of their cultural interests, as with the steampunk Ghostbuster cosplayers here. So as I started trying to make sense of what was going on in these sort of inner geek conflicts and problems, I've found a lot of traction coming out of Certeau's idea of strategies and tactics. And of course, he says that even talking about consumer is misleading because it's such a passive sort of statement. And so just to give a brief review here, so when we talk about strategies with Certeau, these are techniques performed by the powerful. They're operating from a circumscribed proper, whether that's an actual physical spatial proper or just merely institutional. And sort of the archetypal image of that would be like Mad Men ad agencies, in this case literally spatially looking above, looking down on the populace that they're acting on and deploying their strategies of how they want people to consume. On the other hand, we have tactics, which are improvisations performed by the powerless, and he means powerless in a different way than we normally mean it here, marginalized by not having access to the circumscribed spaces rather than some of the other ways that we talk about marginalization in anthropology. So tacticians lack a proper which would allow them to achieve victory of space over time. And so he says that the reading is central in this, and he describes it as a space-making practice, which becomes really important in how I'm going to think through these trends here, that it provides, by creating a reading, a meaning-making practice with a text, you're creating a private space that shelters you from the panoptic gaze of meanings all imposed all around you. But these are also temporary and fragile spaces, according to Certeau, because as he says, you can't write on your TV screen, so you can't make a lasting mark with tactics. So drawing on that, I'd like to talk about the idea of geekdom as a tactical tradition and what that might mean. The first thing, and I'm drawing it also from Michael Saylor here, is this idea of the ironic imagination, a way of reading, a reading tactic that responds to fictional worlds by treating them as real, even though they are known to be false. And so he traces this back to the Baker Street Irregulars, who likes to sort of play a game to pretend that Sherlock Holmes was a real person, that Conan Doyle was only Watson's literary agent, and they had lots of fun engaging with the fictional world in that way. And so this provides, according to Saylor, a way for people to engage these texts in a way that provides enchantment without delusion, and kind of a Weberian sense to, and he calls also disenchanted enchantment. Now, the important thing for the trajectory of geekdom here is the way that early people employing the ironic imagination in the early 20th century found ways to create public spheres of the imagination, with drawing on Habermas's Saylor titles them. This idea that allows them to make the temporary readings attain some kind of permanence. And he looks to the letter columns of early pulp magazines, like Adventure here, as the source where that became places where people could share their meanings and create some sort of sustained space for them. And I think the quotation is a little too small here, but this is the letter in which Hoffman, the editor of Adventure Magazine, institutes what they called Campfire, which was their letters section that people could write in their responses to the pulp stories. And it's important to note that he's using spatial language. He says, why not make that magazine that had collected them, the pulp stories, their meeting place, the place where these readings could collect. And the thing I want to point out too is that he's that title, Campfire, he says our campfire represents human companionship and friendship. So this is when he's viewing it as a space for people to gather and share these meanings, it's not as a public forum, but as a sort of a temporary location to gather and move on, sort of a permanence in mobility. Now, the issue going forward was that these tactics were highly successful for geeks in creating these spaces. And so that what was temporarily, originally just them kind of carving out a space in which they could sustain these readings that allowed them to engage in this disenchantment and enchantment, it became something where they were so successful that they started operating sometimes as strategists themselves. So Ellis emphasized that even though Mondo 2000, a cyberculture magazine that was central for his experiences, even though that was a public sphere, in his early days it was really hard to get. So there was still this sort of labor and working hard to get at it. There was still a sense of intangibility and difficult accessibility there. So, but with the internet making these spaces always available to anyone that has internet access, these spaces have become successfully sustained to the extent that you can also view them as strategists operating from within their own circumscribed spaces, whether that's through moderating comments or just by the permanence of the space itself. And one of the commenters described this problem created as that once you have a space that's that permanent, you're invaded by the dreaded empire of people who don't get the internet, and that they have infiltrated our ranks. And that this is some of the disorientation that Ellis and Oswald are experiencing, and that creating a more permanent space for their readings to exist, they've also made them more accessible. And so, in response to that, the newer generations of geeks and my diagnosis of my analysis of their comments have changed their tactics in ways that Ellis and Oswald were not able to recognize. So previously the main problem, as I said, facing geek culture was finding a way to sustain their virtual worlds. Once the internet helped them to accomplish that initial problem, the new problem is how to avoid the appropriation of those spaces into the strategies of the powerful, often through commercialization or there's also a lot of talk in the comments of people coming in and engaging with these things that they love as if they make all the difference, but these new people don't love them in the way that they do, and so it threatens the identity that they've built around loving those things. And so rather than fighting to maintain control over their spaces, as Ellis's generation did, he talks about culture war a lot in his articles, or destroying them, as Oswald jokingly advocates. I'm seeing in these comment threads geeks simply ceding those spaces they've created and leaving. And I see two directions in the comments where they're going. And the first I call digging down. We're kind of doing both of these simultaneously. And digging down would be gathering more and more detail about that thing that makes all the difference for you. So Ramona Girl says, if too many people like your favorite show, don't follow the writer on Twitter. That's where everyone is. Follow the gaffer, the Keith Rip. So just digging down and finding these unexplored spaces within the cultural landscape. And in some cases, people are able to serve as tour guides and hang on to those things that they love, but and find new spaces within them. The other direction that's pursued simultaneously, and I think probably is a little bit more sustainable strategy for geek culture, is this idea of moving on. And this is where this idea of nomadic tactics come from, is that once the resources have become dried up or no longer as valuable to them, they just move on. So Am Strassner says that he and his friends would find bits of not so popular culture and obsess about them for a short time before moving on. And with this, there's a growing sense that geek identity is not about the objects of consumption, but what's on the plate, is how Oswald mentions it. And so this idea that the journey is the treasure, and the geek as a sort of mode of living, rather than the certain things that they are obsessing about. And Upstate might emphasize the idea that you have to protect those spaces. So I tell you in a cool place, but then everyone would know about it. So to close, I want to propose a different metaphor. Often, especially with the internet, the dominating metaphor has been this idea of pioneers, this homesteading image of people coming in and settling down and sort of permanently making a space for themselves. And there's lots of problematics to that image, especially in terms of masculine and feminine struggles of that's usually coded as a masculine thing to do, and go and be pioneers. So to think about this as a nomadic practice is what we see, I think, happening a little bit more now. And this idea of continuing to move on, and it does seem to be a sustainable practice. And Ellis, in his article, and I'll close with this, says, right now, as you read this, some kid in some basement is hearing the Pixies for the first time, and his head is blowing off his fucking shoulders. That, at least, hasn't changed, and I don't think it ever will. So there's a confidence, even in this disorientation that they're feeling, that as they continue to adapt these strategies and tactics, that they'll be able to move forward and continue making spaces for disenchantment and enchantment. Thank you.